In the random elements phase of Freeverse, players will use dice to fill in these 4 grids on the left of their player sheets. Each grid will give some requirements for the poem they'll be writing in the second phase. More requirements will be harder to meet, but they also can score more points. For this video, we'll look at how the dice are used in each grid. For it to make sense, we'll also talk about how each grid can affect your poem and your score. Each round, 2 white dice will be rolled. For all examples here, let's assume the white dice come up with a 2 and a 4. A black die will also be rolled each round. That will tell you which grid you can choose from on that round. You can see it here on the player sheet. This means you can pick the topic grid if the black die is a 1 or a 2. At the end of the phase, the topic grid will tell you what your poem has to be about. Everyone will have the same 4 words or phrases around the grid, like these. The quadrant that has the most X's at the end will tell you which of those 2 words make the topic for your poem. For example, if most X's were in the upper right, your poem would have to be about these 2 words, school and noise. If the most X's were in the lower right, it would have to somehow combine noise and Saturday. If you decide to use your white dice for the topic grid, one die gives you the column and the other die gives you the row. In this case, if we picked 2 for the column, we'd have to use 4 for the row. So you'd write X in this square. Or using the same dice the other way, you could put an X in column 4, row 2 instead. Now for the line letter grid. It's an option when the black die shows a 2 through 6. This grid will eventually have letters that you have to use in certain lines of the poem. When you choose to mark this grid, one white die will be used for the line of the poem. With your roll, you can pick line 2 or line 4. Let's say you pick line 4. Then the other white die is going to give you some letters to choose from. Look at the letter grid on the right to see which ones. Since you used the 4 die for the line of the poem, we have to use the 2 here. We could choose any of these letters in that row if they haven't been X'd out yet. Let's go with V. The first time you use a letter from that grid, make one diagonal mark. Then later, if you pick it a second time, complete the X. Once a letter is selected twice, you can't select it again. After marking the V square, write V in the first open box of the line letters grid. Now your 4th line of the poem has to have a V in it if you want it to score. For the line syllables grid, you need a roll on the black die of 3 through 6. This grid gives you a syllable requirement for lines of your poem. When filling in this grid, one white die will determine the line, the other will be the amount of syllables you're adding to the requirement. So we can put a 4 in line 2 or a 2 in line 4. Let's go with a 2 in line 4. That means if you don't add anything to it the rest of the round, line 4 of your poem would have to have a total of 2 syllables. A line without any numbers in this grid means there's no requirement. That might seem like a good thing, but be aware a line can only earn points if you eventually give it a letter requirement, as explained in the previous grid, and a syllable requirement in this grid. The last grid is the title letters grid. You can select this if the black die is a 4 through 6. It gives you letters that must appear in 2 words of your poem's title. Here, one die tells you which word you are making a requirement for. A 1, 2, or 3 adds a requirement to this word. 4, 5, 6 is for the other word. Let's say you used a 2, so you'll add a requirement to this word. Just like with the line letters grid, the other white die tells you which row to pick from in the letter grid. In this case, you'd have to use row 4. Let's say you pick the B, you mark it, then write B in the first open square on the title letters grid. Just so you know, the order of these 2 words in your poem's title doesn't matter. Also, your title can have more than 2 words. This process of adding to the grids will be repeated several times. Then players will have time to write their poems using all the requirements they filled in. There are other details in the rules, so be sure to read them over before your first game.